Israeli airstrikes have struck Gaza's biggest hospital.
There's a clear indication that there's looser standards being applied to arms being supplied there.
Had I been in the government, I would probably have sought restrictions sooner. If we're going to restore public services, which are terribly battered in many areas, people are going to have to pay. Stop worrying about tuition fees. It's a form of graduate income tax. One shouldn't be scaremongering about that.
Why do you think the West feel threatened by China?
The ability of the United States to run the world has been undermined by China's growth. China now has a bigger economy than the United States.
This is Critical Edge. Today, we're very lucky to be here with Sir Vince Cable. He was leader of the Liberal Democrats from 2017 to 2019 and was also a key figure in the cabinet in the coalition government from 2010 to 2015 under Sir David Cameron. Vince, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure.
So a question that Lucas and I like to begin asking all our guests is, when was the last time you changed your mind about something big or something important?
Well, politically, I've been fairly consistent. I've changed parties, but my political views haven't changed greatly. But I mean, a topical issue is assisted dying, which of course has been voted on this week. I used to be a very strong opponent, but I've been persuaded partly by meeting people who are, in this critical condition and desperately want to have some agency over their lives, that this is a right that we should give people, albeit with proper safeguards. I have changed my view on that.
It was mostly just meeting those people that changed your mind.
Yes,
so that kind of
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the people with things like multineuron disease, which are just unbelievably awful, are non-curable, and people are totally lucid, and they can make rational decisions.
While we're on that topic, do you think there should be some sorts of policies around it? Like, how does one set the limits of
well, of
what
course,
should be allowed
yes.
and what's not?
That is what the debate's about. It's got to be there's got to be clarity of mind, and somebody's got to be able to adjudicate that. It's got to be in a desperate condition of pain or terminal, probably both. And there have got to be legal safeguards. I understand people like West Streeting are genuinely concerned that, the NHS has got enough problems without trying to set up complicated processes to make sure there's no abuse. But I think if it's tightly ring-fenced, if it's very carefully, the proper safeguards, and that people can't be talked into it, you can't have greedy relatives making people feel they're a burden, then I think it could work for a relatively small number of people who desperately want this ability to end their lives with some dignity.
Yeah, I would probably overall agree with that position as well. We'll move it on to what's topical right now for everyone watching. This might be a few weeks back, but there's been the recent petition for Keir Starmer, for another general election rather. So some vote of no confidence in Keir Starmer with over 2 million votes already. How valid those votes are or not is maybe up for debate, but I was wondering if, first of all, you could give your general opinion on the matter.
It's just utterly absurd.
Yeah.
Right? We've had a general election. I'm not a Labour voter or supporter. I campaigned for the Lib Dems, but it was a very clear outcome. The government has got a mandate for 5 years. They may have made some mistakes in the first few weeks. I mean, governments do. People, judgments are often quite difficult. So this petition is just pure opportunism by people on the populist fringes. I know Mr. Farage is quite prominent in this campaign, but it should not be taken seriously. It doesn't deserve to be taken seriously.
I mean, on the topic of the new Labour government, how do you think Keir's doing overall in terms of, maybe you mentioned mistakes that he's made? What's your opinion?
Well, it's very mixed. I mean, I think he got off to a good start, actually, by the way they handled the riots, which could have easily got out of control and done a great deal of damage. It was dealt with very quickly, effectively, and decisively. I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. I think the mistakes, they've been often discussed, but the winter fuel allowance, it obviously shouldn't be going to people like me. but it could have been handled in a more sensitive way by making it taxable rather than just abolishing it, which has created, people in the threshold areas who could be negatively affected. I honestly don't know about this farmer inheritance tax issue, whether it is indeed 500 or 20,000, people banding all kind of numbers around. And there is a very strong kind of vested interest here. But the idea that this is some kind of big national movement to remove a government that's, impossibly unpopular is just ridiculous.
Yeah, you mentioned the mandate that Keir Starmer's been given for 5 years. I think a lot of the rhetoric surrounding the petition is maybe that he hasn't been faithful to his mandate. There was concerns about whether he would change his policy on pensioners and so on. Do you think there's any point at which Keir Starmer's been disingenuous in his campaigning and whether he'll...
Well, the problem,
remain faithful
as
to
I
his
see it,
mandate?
is that they've been too faithful to their mandate. They made this commitment before the election, which was quite absurd, in my view, which was not raising the basic taxes, universal taxes, income tax, value-added tax. It was very clear that because of the accumulated problems resulting from the financial crisis, the Ukraine war, Brexit, and of course COVID, the government had lots of accumulated debt liabilities which need to be serviced, and taxes are going to have to rise to pay for it. Equally, if we're going to restore public services, which are terribly battered in many areas, people are going to have to pay. And the government should have said during the election campaign, they're going to have to be an increase in taxation. You guys out there are going to have to pay. And they would have lost some votes, but they would have at least prepared themselves properly. But they made this commitment, so they didn't have to make. They desperately need to raise revenue, and they've gone for all these fiddly little tax changes and the winter fuel allowance, which don't raise much money and cause a lot of angst. So it wasn't that they've failed to maintain their mandate. They've just been too rigid about sticking to a mandate that was totally inappropriate.
I suppose then, whilst we're on the topic of sticking perhaps too rigidly to a mandate, your coalition government received perhaps the opposite criticism, which was that, for example, there was a number of commitments made, like not raising tuition fees, which then won back on. Of course, a lot of that had to do with the fact that you were in a coalition government, but this meant that the Lib Dems performed very, very badly afterwards, and you were part of trying to recover that. So in retrospect, do you think the Lib Dems should have been making those commitments at the time?
No, they should never have made them. There was a lot of internal argument between me and my colleagues and party leader. I thought it was absolutely wrong to have made that promise to students, completely wrong, because there was no way could be sustained. I mean, the government was bankrupt. I'm exaggerating, but very serious financial problem. The universities were almost literally bankrupt, some of them. There was a desperate need for revenue for the universities. It was going to have to come from fees. I was the minister who was, given the hospital pass to deal with this problem. It was absolutely unavoidable. There were no better choices. And what we did was right, in my view. It was good policy, but terrible politics. We should never have made the commitment.
Let's talk more generally then about how not only going back on those commitments, but in general being in coalition government, let's say how the long-term impact was for the Lib Dems there. Do you think it was a mistake entering into that coalition government terms of the performance?
Yeah, it was unavoidable.
It
was unavoidable. If you look back at the time, the arithmetic meant that the only way we could get a stable government was if the Lib Dems partnered with the Tories. Most of us didn't want to do it. We were very uncomfortable about frankly, if the country had a government, it was the only way we could do it and provide some stability. And it was at a time of extreme financial stress. There was an economic crisis. I don't think we'd have been forgiven if we'd been playing silly games around that. So we had to do it in the national interest. I think we knew when we did so that we were going to lose a lot of support, but it would establish the Lib Dems as a serious party of government, which it did. I mean, there were many of the good things that were done in the coalition were down to the Lib Dems. I mean, all the changes around the pupil premium in schools, the pension protection, the stuff I did around industrial strategy, which was many successful, British Business Bank. there's a whole list of things which the Tories weren't keen on or opposed, but we pushed through. And also we stopped the Tories doing a lot of very negative things, about basic labor rights, for example, deregulating to an extreme and damaging degree. And these are the things we stopped. And I'm proud of having served in that government, but it did do us harm, of course. But the damage in 2015, I think, wasn't primarily a vote of confidence in the coalition government, which is generally thought by the public to be doing a good job. But the Tories turned on us and said, if you vote Lib Dem, they may be good MPs, but you're going to get Miliband and the SNP. And people were frightened that they didn't want that. And so we were squeezed under the tactical voting system.
So following that then, of course, the Liberal Democrats have had somewhat of a resurgence in the recent election. They've certainly performed better than in the interim, but nonetheless, they haven't quite gone back to their former prominence. What do you think the Liberal Democrats can be doing now to distinguish themselves, especially as a centre party in a two-party system? It's not easy.
Well, I would contest your premise. Actually, the number of MPs is the largest since the 1920s, so the recovery is absolute. And although there was some criticism, Ed Davies' campaign was very effective. We targeted all our resources on seats we could win rather than spreading around the country. And I think this was in the offing for quite a long time. And when I was party leader, we got up to 20% plus in the public opinion polls. We were doing very well in local and then European elections. Unfortunately, we did very badly in the subsequent general election, which we didn't need to have actually at that time. Anyway, I don't need to go over all that history. The simple point is the Lib Dems are back to a position of considerable strength. What they needed to do now, I'm not wanting to be a backseat driver, but the obvious point is consolidating the 72 seats I think they have in Parliament, working hard in the constituencies. Lib Dems are very good at that. The second thing is building back up the position we once had of great strength in local government. And that includes the sort of northern cities. It's often been forgotten that Lib Dems used to run Liverpool, Sheffield, Newcastle, Oldham, big, and further south, Bristol at one point. We've been running Portsmouth until recently. So we've had a very strong urban base, which disappeared after 2015 mostly. That can now be recovered, and that's where the energies should lie. Of course, we've got to be critical of the Labour government where it makes mistakes. I think Ed Davies doing that, but it's got to be constructive criticism, not the kind of nihilistic populism that you're getting from the Reform Party.
Just one more point then, before we move on. I wanted to ask about the first past the post system, just since you mentioned the 20% in the popular polling. The Liberal Democrats have, of course, historically suffered the most from that. The ratio of number of people voting to seat in Parliament is, I think, has historically at certain points been over 10x for Liberal Democrats compared to Labour and government. Do you support the first past the post system in general? And if not,
no, the Lib Dems have argued for decades and decades for reform of the voting system to make it more representative, to give small parties, including the Lib Dems, but also the Greens and others, a proper share in parliamentary representation. And the fact that we've learnt to game the system, the Lib Dems, I think, have got 11% of the seats in Parliament with 11% of the vote. We've, by targeting, have learned how to game the system. But actually, as a matter of principle, we should continue to argue for electoral reform and a more proportional system.
Thank you. We'll move it on now to a short section just to discuss for our audience, which is a relatively young audience, maybe age 20 to 30, what sort of advice you'd give them in now maybe increasingly unstable times geopolitically, but also within the UK. They've got tuition fees are supposedly being increased by Keir Starmer. I suppose what wisdom you might have.
Well, no, I'm not sure I have much wisdom. I am a grandfather, and I have grandchildren who are going through the system. One's just graduated, and others going up to university next year. So I'm sure I do share their problems. Well, first of all, you stop worrying about tuition fees. People don't have to pay fees when they come to university. As you know, it's a form of graduate income tax. You pay it later in life if you've got a reasonable income. So one shouldn't be scaremongering about that. And anyway, the increase that's proposed is quite small. In terms of general advice, I mean, the world is, rapid flux. I mean, that's the key point. Many of the new jobs that are coming into the market didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, one of my grandchildren has just finished a degree in data science, right? Data science didn't exist, as a course until very recently. And it's generating through AI and related technologies a whole host of new opportunities. So I think the thing for young people is that they've got to be prepared for a world of rapid change. That means that they've got to develop not specific skills, though clearly there are some you need for employment, but this ability to learn and adapt and recognize that there isn't the same stability of employment that there was when I was in the labour market. You can't go into a bank preparing for a 30-year career or the civil service, even the civil service. Journalism as a profession no longer resembles what it once was. Of course, now all online, and you don't have a diversity of outlets. So the media has changed, science has changed, teaching has changed the profession. And young people have just got to, I think, be prepared for the fact that we're in this world of rapid flux, and to learn to be adaptable and not become depressed by the pressures to change.
Yeah, I think some people might feel slightly out of control, or rather that they don't have much control. It's probably the better way to phrase it, in that you're asking people to be adaptable, but some people feel that it's just they are being molded rather than having some sort of ability to
Well, you're right.
mold their own lives.
As I said, the traditional structures no longer there. I mean, I left college, left university. You could look forward to a career, over 20, 30 years in many professions, which are now dissolving. You had pensions, you had career structures with gradations in pay and things, and a lot of that's disappearing. But there's no way you can bring it back. I mean, that's the nature of modern technology, and there's no point wanting to go back to the previous century. It doesn't exist. So it is hard, and I do understand there's a lot of kids that can't cope with this. I mean, I'm patron of a local charity that deals with mental illness issues amongst young people, and it is escalating. And a lot of that, of course, due to the pandemic rather than the nature of change. But no, there is a lot of pressure and there is a lot of stress, and people have got to learn to cope with it.
Yeah, I feel like there's also another element to it, in that some people might argue, change, there's always been change. Things from 1830 were different than they were in 1930, and they will look different in 2030. So perhaps on the change that's going on right now in Europe, in the Middle East as well, but maybe firstly in Europe, how would you react to the recent developments in Ukraine and Russia's increased pressure and UK and USA's further backing?
Well, so if I can backtrack to the
Sure.
previous question, which I didn't fully answer. I mean, it isn't that we're living in a completely chaotic environment and people have got to suffer it. You can make employment more stable, which is, I think, what the government's trying to do. You can make tenancies more stable. There are ways in which people can be helped to live in a world of flux. So one shouldn't be despairing, but we're for technological reasons, we're in a much more fast-moving world that you can't just slow down because it's uncomfortable. But on your bigger question about the world, I took a personal interest in the Ukraine war. I went to Ukraine fairly early on. I got the bus from Warsaw Airport, and spent some time talking to decision makers and think tanks and universities in Ukraine, and developed a very strong feeling that we should be giving them maximum support. And I think Britain has a pretty commendable record certainly under the last government, under this one too. We should stick with them. They're very worried, obviously, that Trump is going to pull the rug from under their feet. But I think the British and the European countries have got to make it clear that Putin shouldn't just be allowed to walk over them. I mean, there is going to have to be a messy compromise, but we should give the Ukrainians the maximum support we can financially and militarily.
Is there a risk in doing that, do you think?
Yeah, there is a risk, and certainly giving more advanced weapons is taking a risk. And but I think that the Russians have calculated that the Western countries will back off under nuclear blackmail and their general approach, and as a result, they've got a sort of tactical advantage. And I think that there are occasions when, although it's risky, when I think the Western countries have to stand firm, and this is one of them.
I mean, only a few days ago, Lieutenant General from the UK said that if Russia were to invade anywhere else in Eastern Europe, then they would go straight there and put UK and other forces on the ground. How likely do you see this being in the upcoming months, and how likely do you think that is to turn into something much more significant?
Well, not very likely. I mean, after all, the Russians have struggled to make any headway against Ukraine. I mean, the idea that their tanks can then roll over the rest of Europe is beyond fantasy. But there are bits on the periphery of Europe which are vulnerable. I mean, Moldova is an obvious one, possibly the Baltic states. And we are part of an alliance which includes certainly the latter three. And we should honour that. The fact is, Britain's defence capability has run down, and that's partly because we haven't had a particularly successful economy. We've more or less done our 2% of GDP, but I think Britain has got to put more resources into defence, along with other bits of the public realm, which goes back to your very first question, and why I think we are going to have to accept higher levels of basic taxation.
Thank you. I want to ask a bit more in general about providing arms and support. When you were in government, you opposed providing arms to the Saudi Air Force for fears of Saudi involvement in Yemen. There seems to be a bit of a double standard when that comes to providing arms to Israel and investigation about international law. Do you think the UK should be providing arms to Israel? And do you think there should be greater strictness on looking at how these arms are being used?
Well, the rules are very strict and they're very explicit, as I discovered because I was the Secretary of State who had ultimate responsibility, though other government departments have to agree to a decision on arm exports, whether controversial. There is a very strict set of criteria which govern arms export licenses, and you're very much bound by legal matters. Ministers can't just say, "Oh, I don't like this government, I'm not going to approve arms exports." When I was the Secretary of State, there were several occasions where I did stop arms export licenses. One was in relation to Saudi Arabia, and that was because of the evidence which had emerged about the bombing of hospitals. There was a human rights issue there, and humanitarian issue. It was actually quite strongly opposed by my Conservative colleagues who didn't agree that I should withdraw the licenses. We had a very messy compromise in the last days of the government. In fact, while we were out campaigning on the streets, I was on the telephone to the Minister of Defence making my case that we restrict the licenses. In relation to Israel, we did the same during the Gaza war. I did insist that the response on the Israeli side was disproportionate. We worked with Nick Clegg. We did win the argument in government that there had to be some restriction. We did restrict arms export. But by the time it became effective, the fighting had stopped, so it became redundant. But we did take a stand on that issue. But I would add, it's not, the morality of these things is not altogether straightforward. I mean, there are cases where arms exports were restricted, which I didn't agree with. I mean, a good example was there was a company in Aberdeen, part of the oil supply chain, which had invented these special devices which could rescue submariners if they were trapped underwater. Very sophisticated technology. And I thought, this is fine. They wanted to supply it to Russia. And Russia, of course, had that horrible Kursk disaster, which you may remember, when I think 100 submariners were killed by being trapped. And I thought that this doesn't affect defense capability. But my colleagues in government took the view that, Russia is an adversary. We should not be supplying them with any kit of military value. So I was overruled, but I wanted to supply something covered by licensing.
If you don't mind, I'll be a little bit more specific then. I do agree in general that there should be strict restrictions, and I am aware that there are in general strict restrictions. I just think in the case of Israel and the current situation in Gaza, perhaps they're being applied more loosely. I mean, something like 90% of hospitals in Gaza are no longer existent. The death toll is around 160,000, most of which are civilians. And yet the UK has only stopped supplying around 10% of arms. It seems to me that there's a pretty significant likelihood that more than 10% are being used in the broaching of international law. Do you not think that there's a clear indication that there's looser standards being applied to arms being supplied?
I think it's a genuinely tricky issue, actually. One of the basic principles is that Israel has the right to defend itself. And they are actually or potentially under attack from Iran. And we've seen this. And so trying to create a defensive system which protects them seems to be legitimate. On the other hand, the reaction within the Gaza Strip, and you've quoted a couple of points about it, it does seem to be disproportionate. So you have a very difficult balancing act, actually. And it's rather similar to the case which I had 10 years ago when the Gaza war was continuing. And we did agree eventually that some arms associated with the Air Force, which were being used to bomb civilian areas, should be restricted, but that we shouldn't simply outlaw Israel from defense equipment because it had a legitimate defense concern.
So I suppose the ultimate question, and you've partly answered this, is whether or not it's justified for the UK to be giving this amount of weapons to Israel, and whether you think there is some kind of double standard from a Western perspective.
Well, on the basis of what I've read, I think had I been in the government, I would probably have sought restrictions sooner and more substantially. But I do recognize the complexity of the issue. It's not straightforward. About double standard, well, the world is, of course there are double standards, and this whole war is not helping the cause of the West broadly, because we are supporting a fairly aggressive response to terrorism. But if other countries respond to terrorism aggressively, we then give them big lectures. I mean, China and Xinjiang is a good example. So, yeah, we are setting ourselves up for criticism. And it's very clear that most of the countries in the so-called global south have been alienated from the West as a result of the commitments that have been made in respect of Israel.
Thank you. We'll leave the Gaza conflict there for now because it is a very complex issue and maybe not the main talking point of this interview. In the last remaining 15 minutes, we wanted to move it on to maybe two main topics, which are connected as well, as the USA and China, and maybe their relationship. First of all, Trump was very recently elected as the president of the United States of America, defeating Kamala Harris. What are your opinions on his protectionism and the new, stronger tariffs that he's looking to introduce?
Well, protectionism is a very bad thing in trade policy. written about a dozen books. The first one I wrote was about protectionism. I was writing about the problems caused by trade barriers back in the 1970s, long before it was a major problem. So as trade policy goes, it's dreadful, and it poses costs on the countries that do it and on the rest of the world. And world economic activity, both as it affects us and as it affects poorer countries, is going to be harmed by trade conflict. So unambiguously, this is a bad thing, and I've no time for people who are trying to make excuses for it.
Yeah. Do you think maybe from the perspective of the average American person, that it is a positive thing? Maybe not from a wider perspective, from maybe a global perspective, but for the average American, maybe strengthening their own economy in this way, in this current kind of global climate, is the way forward for them.
Well, the public clearly like it,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean to say that it's in America's interest. The first Trump administration resorted to a certain amount of tariffs in relation to China and indeed other countries. A lot of economic analysis has been done, which shows very clearly that it was damaging, that it added to the inflation, which we know is very unpopular. It didn't create any employment. But yeah, it has a sort of political appeal. Bashing foreigners often does, but it's bad, terrible economics, and bad for the country doing it.
Sorry, just before Ollie interrupts, why is it bad for the country? Just, I think maybe for those listening who might not be very clued in on protectionism and like the finer economic details.
Well, the most obvious point is that it pushes up costs and pushes up prices. And if central banks then trying to restrain inflation, it hits the economy and creates unemployment. There are particular industries which might benefit from temporary protection. If you go back to the history of this argument about free trade, which is Adam Smith in the end of the 18th century, and the people he was arguing with, and people in the United States like Alexander Hamilton, who used to make the case for limited protection of strategic industries. There is a case in some particular areas where you're trying to give an industry some years to grow and without facing the full blast of international competition. There's some justification, but general tariffs have very little to say for them. The one point that can be made in favor of Trump is that he may, we're not clear about this, but he may see this primarily as a tactic to try to get other countries to reduce their trade barriers. I don't believe it, but he's been talking about this for 30 years. Back then Japan was the enemy, now it's China. So it's fairly clear where he's coming from. But you can make a kind of tactical argument that a bit like in the military, by having a deterrent, you may get other countries to back down and reduce their trade barriers. But I don't honestly think that's what Trump's about.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm just going to make things a little bit more specific, and I want to talk about kind of, the perhaps more uneducated working class in America and how freer trade might impact them. The manufacturing industry is really struggling in America, and whilst on certain economic indicators, free trade is a good thing, nonetheless, there would be many, or there have been many, who have become structurally unemployed or significantly more struggling due to the fact that they are worse educated and unable to get other jobs when they lose these sorts of manufacturing jobs, which, for example, China is excelling at right now. So what would you say to those people? What would be a solution which maintains free trade and supports the country in general, and yet doesn't just increase GDP for those who are better off, but as a general brings the country up?
Well, there's a lot of economic analysis which has taken place in the United States on what causes job losses and the contribution of trade. And there are some serious economic studies which suggest that in some parts of the country, Chinese competition, almost certainly accelerated the loss of employment in traditional industries, whether it's textiles, clothing, or consumer electronics, whatever. So there's a fair question about what you have to do to help people who are affected by change, whether it's produced by technology, which is actually much the more important factor, or by external competition. And you clearly have to have a program of adjustment assistance to help communities adjust to change. This is an argument we've had in this country, around shipbuilding, which was Japan and Korean competition originally, and the textile industry in Lancashire. And all those industries have gone. And temporary protection, which we had in the case of textiles, subsidies in the case of shipbuilding, didn't stop it, because ultimately competition was going to come from somewhere, and technology was a key driver in all these industries. So it wasn't possible to stop the loss of employment in traditional manufacturing industries by protection. No Western country has succeeded in doing it. Even Germany has accepted that in the more labor-intensive manufacturing industries, you have to adapt. But that's not an argument for just neglecting areas. You do need assistance. What's now called help for the left behind areas. It matters. I'm not a great fan of the Boris Johnson government, but one of the things he gets some credit for is recognizing that left behind bits of the UK, which are often industrial areas faced with international competition, were just allowed to decline, and nothing was done to help them. And as a country, we've been bad at that. So refocusing on left behind areas, improving their infrastructure, channeling relatively higher share of the national income in their direction, education particularly. I mean, clearly you can't just be completely passive and accept laissez-faire, but that's not an argument really for putting up trade barriers.
Right. So I suppose off the back of that, why do you think the West, Trump, maybe more generally, feel threatened by China economically? Is it more to do with feeling, I don't know, that they're going to lose jobs? Do you think it's more of an emotional reaction? Do you think there's something maybe more geopolitical there? What do you think?
Well, of the three things you've mentioned, the last two, I think, are the key here. The United States has, for almost a century, been the world's undisputed superpower. That is now under threat because China has grown, incredible economic performance over 4 decades. It was going to happen. The only way the United States was ever going to remain as an undisputed superpower economically was if the poor countries were kept poor. But they're not, and they're developing. And China now has a bigger economy than the United States on some measures, purchasing power. And so its economy is going to grow relatively, but there are 4 times as many people, three to 4 times as many people. So as per capita income rises in China, the Chinese economy is going to be relatively bigger. And if you have a bigger economy, you've got more, you can spend more on defense, you can spend more on soft power, and so on. So the ability of the United States to run the world has been undermined by China's growth and reemergence. Because China was 2 centuries ago the biggest economy in the world. Now it's gone back to that. And it's not just China. I mean, I've just come back from India. I mean, India is going to be a future economic superpower like China. Eventually, it will eclipse the United States, probably. But this is economic development.
Yeah, I suppose my problem then, more generally with this sort of, I'd say you have a generally laissez-faire attitude to trade, even though you've said there are some exceptions, is that quite often, and I'm not speaking in the Chinese case specifically, there can be imbalances of power. Let's take as a microcosm, a hyperbolic example, the Congo and the mining of lithium, right? There is theoretically free trade there, and yet the West really is using workers in horrific conditions in order to get the resources that they need. And we see this much more generally with post-colonial relations. Without being just laissez-faire, how can we look to redress those imbalances whilst nonetheless supporting the economies of both sides of that?
No, I'm not arguing for laissez-faire. I've made that fairly clear, both in the domestic economy and internationally. Of course, they've got to be safeguarded.
With regards to free trade,
I'm a general.
free.
Yes, I'm generally in
protecting
favour of free trade, and the reason is very clear. If you look at what's happened in the world economy in the last 3 to 4 decades, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty as a result of trade. They wouldn't have otherwise have happened. It's not just China, but India, which is becoming a middle-income country, Bangladesh, which was a basket case 40 years ago. Now, I wouldn't say it's not a rich country, it's not a developed country, but people, tens of billions have been lifted out of poverty. The same is now happening at the moment with Vietnam. I mean, and these are all countries that are progressing through trade. That's not to say that, where there are abuses, we shouldn't deal with them. And in the case of China, it is certainly true that their companies, with or without the government, a lot of their companies do engage in questionable practices. In some industries, there is a government subsidy which distorts competition, and the European Union, I think, is entirely within its rights to impose what are called countervailing duties to offset the unfairness that comes from government subsidy. We don't any longer run the Congo, so I'm not quite sure how you envisage imposing.
Nonetheless, there is an exploitative relationship there, is there not?
There is an exploitative relationship. All mining companies, whether they're Chinese or other, the Chinese are their companies are particularly hard-headed and ruthless, but I think all companies have exploited weak African regimes, of which the Congolese is one of the worst.
Thank you. We'll leave it as partly to our audience to maybe come to their own conclusions about what's been a really fun, but also I think detailed and interesting discussion. We'll leave it there for today. Vince,
Okay.
do you have any closing words for us, but also for our audience?
No, I'm delighted to see that you've got this very enterprising project and taking advantage of the current enthusiasm for podcasts. I'm sure that in the market you'll do very well.
On that positive note, Servants Cable, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Vince.